This video focuses on elections after the formation of political parties and elections in which two or more major party candidates ran. Number 5. 1864, Abraham Lincoln versus George B. McClellan. Lincoln won 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. Lincoln carried 22 states to McClellan's 3. And Lincoln won 55.1% of the popular vote to McClellan's 44.9%. Lincoln swept the nation in victory, winning a second term. The 11 states which had seceded did not participate in the election. Still, Lincoln's victory was far from guaranteed in early or even mid-1864, and through much of the year, Lincoln actually believed he would lose. However, battlefield successes in August and September bolstered support for the ongoing Civil War. Also, dissident radical Republicans eventually united behind Lincoln. On the other hand, the Democrats remained splintered into various factions. McClellan wasn't even aligned with the party's goal to make peace with the Confederates. Instead, he wanted to finish the war, but wasn't committed to ending slavery in the South the way Lincoln was. The three states McClellan won were New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. New Jersey was McClellan's home state at the time. Kentucky, which was McClellan's strongest state, was actually Lincoln's birth state. Number 4. 1804, Thomas Jefferson versus Charles Pinckney. Jefferson won 162 electoral votes to Pinckney's 14. Jefferson carried 15 states to Pinckney's 2. Jefferson won 73.2% of the popular vote to Pinckney's 26.7%. When Jefferson had won his first term against John Adams in 1880, the election had been close. However, Jefferson became very popular during his 4 years as president due to the Louisiana Purchase, suspending hostilities during the French Revolutionary Wars, and having a strong economy. The Federalists were unable to run an effective campaign, let alone one against a popular president. In July of 1804, their leader, Alexander Hamilton, was killed, leaving the party in disarray. The Federalists attacked Jefferson's character and policies, but the attacks had little impact. The two states Pinckney won were Delaware and Connecticut. Both were Federalist strongholds, which voted Federalist in every election in which the party ran a candidate. All other New England states swung for Jefferson. In the Federalist versus Democratic-Republican era, this was the only time Massachusetts voted Democratic-Republican. Pinckney even lost his home state, South Carolina. Number 3, 1972, Richard Nixon versus George McGovern. Nixon won 520 electoral votes to McGovern's 17. Nixon carried 49 states to McGovern's 1. And Nixon won 60.7% of the popular vote to McGovern's 37.5%. Nixon's history with presidential elections would hardly suggest a landslide winner. He lost in 1960 and had a hard-fought victory in 1968. However, when running for re-election in 1972, he had momentum. The economy had rebounded during his first term, and he was effective in foreign affairs. His main detractors were the far right and the far left, but neither were able to mount effective opposition. The Democratic Party was still in disarray from 1968. As various factions contended for the heart of the party, Democratic voters were ultimately left with George McGovern as their candidate. McGovern didn't have much working in his favor. He wasn't well known nationally and didn't appeal to certain traditionally Democratic constituencies. Furthermore, he suffered from internal campaign problems and was farther left than even many in his own party were comfortable with. It was easy for the Nixon campaign to paint him as a radical and turn what would have been a win into an overwhelming victory. The one state McGovern won was Massachusetts, which had been a Democratic stronghold since 1960. McGovern even lost his home state, South Dakota. Nixon became the first Republican to sweep the entire South in victory. This was one of only 3 times a candidate won over 500 electoral college votes. Nixon's victory in the popular vote was by double digits. Polling ahead of the election had predicted a large victory for Nixon. Number 2, 1984, Ronald Reagan versus Walter Mondale. Reagan won 525 electoral votes to Mondale's 13. Reagan carried 49 states to Mondale's 1, and Reagan won 58.8% of the popular vote to Mondale's 40.6%. Halfway through Reagan's first term, it didn't seem likely he would win 1984 in a landslide victory or even win at all. The economy had struggled, and his approval ratings even dropped to 35%. However, by the time of the election, the economy had rebounded and the nation had seen some military successes. In addition, Reagan's campaign crafted a very optimistic vision of the future, which resonated with many voters. Mondale had an uphill battle. He had been the vice president to Jimmy Carter, who Reagan had defeated in a landslide in 1980. Mondale's message of improving relations with the Soviet Union didn't connect with many voters, nor did his pledge to raise taxes. Many also point to his choice of running mate as part of the reason for the loss, along with his lack of charisma, which was all the more evident against a seasoned entertainer like Reagan. The one state Mondale won was Minnesota, his home state. Even here, he only won the popular vote by a few thousand votes. Reagan had also won a landslide victory against Carter in 1980, though Carter had managed to win 6 states as opposed to Mondale's 1. This was one of only 3 times a candidate won over 500 electoral college votes. Reagan's victory in the popular vote was by double digits, and as of this recording, he is the last presidential candidate to accomplish this. Polling generally had predicted a large victory for Reagan. Number 1, 1936, Franklin D. Roosevelt versus Alf Landon. Roosevelt won 523 electoral votes to Landon's 8. Roosevelt carried 46 states to Landon's 2. Roosevelt won 60.8% of the popular vote to Landon's 36.5%. Roosevelt entered his run for a second term with the odds in his favor. He had, in fact, won his first term with a landslide victory, and since then, his New Deal programs, such as unemployment benefits and Social Security, had become popular with many voters, though the Great Depression was still ongoing. Meanwhile, much of the country still blamed the Depression on the Republicans. The nation had punished them severely in the congressional elections of 1932 and 1934 and saw no signs of letting up. Furthermore, Landon was not seen as a strong candidate. Compared to the charismatic Roosevelt, he was infamously absent on the campaign trail. He didn't provide a strong alternative plan to the New Deal either. Simply, he argued that the programs were good but mismanaged. The 2 states Landon won were Vermont and Maine, which he won handedly. Both were nearly unbreakable Republican strongholds, and neither swung for Roosevelt in any of his 4 landslide victories. Landon lost his home state, Kansas, and he lost it by over 7 percentage points. This was one of only 3 times a candidate won over 500 electoral college votes. Roosevelt's victory in the popular vote was by double digits. The vast majority of polls predicted a victory for Roosevelt, but most didn't predict nearly the landslide he'd end up winning by. Honorable mentions: 1964, Lyndon Johnson versus Barry Goldwater. Johnson won 61.1% of the popular vote, the largest share of the popular vote since the advent of widespread popular elections in 1824. Also, it was the largest share of the popular vote any Democratic Party candidate ever carried, even outdoing Roosevelt's victory in 1936. Johnson's massive victory had been attributed to his support for civil rights, fears of how Goldwater would handle international conflicts, and sympathy towards the Democrats because of the John F. Kennedy assassination. Johnson won every state except for the 5 Deep South states and Arizona, Goldwater's home state. 1820, James Monroe. Monroe won almost by default as the dying Federalist Party failed to nominate a candidate. It was nearly a unanimous victory, if not for one faithless elector, casting his vote for Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who wasn't even running. 1788 through 89 and 1792, George Washington. George Washington won unanimously both times he was elected president. Because of the election rules at the time, which determined that the second-place candidate became vice president, Washington technically had election rivals, but they were essentially just running for vice president. Washington was beloved throughout all the states for his leadership during the War for Independence. It's been said that the only other man who could have contested him was Benjamin Franklin, also beloved for his wartime efforts. However, Franklin wasn't running for president and vehemently supported Washington. If you enjoyed this video, consider browsing the channel for other videos on United States presidents, all the way from George Washington to modern presidents, discussing their political careers, personal lives, and places in history.